He fired her in front of everyone. No warning. No mercy. Just a cold stare and 2 words that cut like a blade: "You're done." The black maid stood there trembling, her hands still wet from the floor she'd been scrubbing, her eyes filled with humiliation. And Richard Moreau, the ruthless billionaire, didn't even blink. To him, she was nothing. Just another name on a payroll, another face he'd forget by morning. That was the kind of man he was: untouchable, unfeeling, and proud of it. He believed money could buy anything: loyalty, silence, even forgiveness. But fate has a strange way of humbling the powerful. Because days later, that same maid's little girl collapsed in his garden. And the man who once destroyed lives with a signature was about to face a decision that would tear his soul apart. This is the story of Richard Moreau, a billionaire who learned too late that true wealth isn't measured in what you own, but in what you're willing to give away. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. In the heart of Los Angeles, where the skyline shimmered with glass towers and ambition, stood a mansion that people whispered about but few had ever entered. It rose from the hills like a monument to power, a place where wealth didn't just exist, it ruled. The man who owned it, Richard Moreau, was a name that carried weight across boardrooms and dinner tables alike. To the business world, he was brilliance wrapped in ice. To those who worked under him, he was something else entirely: a storm in a tailored suit. They called him the Untouchable. The name wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. Competitors who challenged him found their companies buried overnight. Partners who crossed him were quietly erased from the industry. He didn't shout or threaten, he simply acted, and ruin followed. Even his silence had power: sharp, heavy, and deliberate. He didn't need loyalty, he demanded results. Within the cold walls of his mansion, everything gleamed but nothing lived. The marble floors reflected every light but absorbed no warmth. The staff moved like ghosts, their footsteps soft, their breaths shallow. Rules were unspoken yet absolute: no laughter, no noise, no mistakes. The walls seemed to listen, and the man they belonged to noticed everything. Richard's life was efficiency dressed as luxury. His mornings began at 5, his schedule arranged to the minute. Breakfasts were silent. Meetings ruthless. Success was his religion, and emotions had no place in his temple. He didn't believe in kindness. He believed in control. It was on one of those rigid mornings that the rhythm of his world shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly. A new maid arrived. She came through the servants' gate with nothing but a small brown suitcase and the kind of calm that made others uneasy. Her name was Angela Johnson. She was in her early 30s, soft-spoken, with a tired grace of someone who had carried too many burdens and complained about none. Her uniform, crisp navy blue with a white apron, looked almost too large for her thin frame. She didn't wear jewelry, only a plain silver cross that glinted faintly when the light caught it. Her eyes were deep brown, but what struck people most wasn't their color, it was their quiet steadiness. From the first day, she worked differently. She didn't rush or chatter like the others. She moved through the mansion with quiet precision, as though her hands had learned patience from life itself. When other maids whispered gossip or shared fears of the untouchable, Angela listened without comment. Her silence unsettled them. In a house ruled by fear, she carried an odd kind of peace. Richard noticed her the way one might notice a shift in air pressure before a storm. It wasn't attraction. It was irritation, the discomfort of someone whose order had been subtly disrupted. He saw her in passing, in the reflection of his office glass, dusting the grand piano he hadn't played in years, in the hallway, where she would pause before his portrait, perhaps wondering how someone could look so cold even in oil paint. One morning, as he descended the staircase, he caught her singing softly under her breath, a low, soothing hum, a song from nowhere and everywhere at once. She froze when she saw him, eyes wide, the melody dying instantly. Richard stared at her for a long moment, not out of anger but because he had forgotten what a human voice sounded like in that house. "Next time," he said sharply, "save your music for your home." "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice even, respectful. But there was something in her tone, not defiance, not fear, something far rarer, dignity. That night, Richard found himself unable to sleep. The faint trace of that melody echoed in his mind, weaving through memories he thought long buried, of a time when his mother used to hum by the window before the world taught him that softness was weakness. He told himself it meant nothing. Yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't fire her. Days passed. Weeks followed. Angela's presence became like background music, gentle but constant. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried weight. Once when the chef shouted at her for breaking a plate, she simply said, "I'll pay for it, sir," and went back to work. Her calmness disarmed cruelty. Her silence confronted arrogance. Even the staff began treating one another differently around her, a small rebellion against the mansion's coldness. One afternoon, a thunderstorm swept across the hills, and the mansion lost power. The staff scrambled, panicked, except Angela. Richard found her lighting candles in the dining room, the flame trembling in her hands. When he entered, she straightened instantly, eyes downcast. "Why aren't you afraid of storms?" he asked suddenly. She hesitated, then said quietly, "Because storms always end, sir. Some just take longer than others." He stared at her, thrown off balance by the simplicity of her answer. That night, he stood at his office window, watching lightning tear across the city skyline, thinking about the maid who wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, he wondered if his empire had made him powerful, or just alone. But he pushed the thought away. Men like him didn't entertain weakness. He told himself she was just a maid, one of dozens. Yet deep inside, something in his perfectly controlled world had cracked, not enough to notice, but enough to let in light. He didn't know that Angela carried her own quiet storms, a daughter at home, a past lined with loss, a husband's grave she still visited on Sundays. He didn't know that beneath her calm lived pain. All he knew was that her silence had begun to echo in him. And in the weeks to come, that echo would become something much larger, a reminder that even the untouchable can be touched, and that the walls we build to protect our hearts often become the cages that suffocate them. But on that morning, standing at the top of his marble staircase, Richard Moreau still believed he controlled his world. He didn't yet realize that the maid dusting the railing below would soon rewrite his story, not with rebellion or revenge, but with something far stronger: grace. He had told himself that what happened to Lila wasn't his burden to bear. She was his maid's child, a tragedy of circumstance, not responsibility. That's what he whispered to his conscience. But the mansion that had always felt like a fortress suddenly became a place of chaos and fear. The faint scent of tulips mixed with panic as Angela knelt on the grass, clutching her daughter's fragile body. Lila's little fingers trembled in her mother's hands, her lips turning a pale shade of blue. Her sketchbook lay open beside her, a half-finished drawing of a flower, its colors bleeding from the drizzle that had just begun to fall. "Lila. Baby, please wake up," Angela pleaded, her voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. She shook her gently, her heart pounding louder than the distant thunder rolling across the sky. The other servants rushed in confusion, forming a circle but keeping their distance, terrified of breaking the silence that had fallen over the mansion's garden. Richard stood a few steps away, frozen. His phone was in his hand, but his fingers wouldn't move. His brain screamed at him to act, but his body wouldn't obey. The man who could sign a contract worth millions without blinking suddenly found himself incapable of dialing 3 simple numbers. It was Angela who snapped him out of it. "Call an ambulance," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. That single command, spoken not with respect but with power, shook him. He obeyed. Minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced the still air. The mansion's iron gates opened for the first time not to welcome investors or guests, but to let in chaos. Paramedics rushed through the corridor, lifting Lila's small body onto a stretcher. Her hand slipped from Angela's grasp, limp and weightless. Angela followed closely, her sobs echoing through the marble hallways that had never known the sound of grief. Richard stood in the doorway, drenched in guilt and confusion. He had seen countless lives ruined in his climb to power, but none of those moments had felt like this. This was different. It was real. It was close. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights hummed with a cold indifference. Angela sat in the waiting area, her clothes still damp, her hands clasped tightly together. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt from the garden. She whispered prayers between gasps, words half-formed and trembling. Richard arrived minutes later, escorted by one of his drivers. He didn't belong there, his tailored suit, his polished shoes, his commanding aura. None of it fit in a place where pain was the only currency. When Angela saw him, she didn't rise or bow. She just looked at him, hollow-eyed, as though seeing through him. The doctor approached, clipboard in hand, his tone professional but heavy. "She's stable for now," he said softly, "but her kidneys have failed completely. We'll need a transplant soon, within days or—" Angela's heart sank. She didn't need him to finish. "I'll do the test," she said quickly, standing. "Take whatever you need. Blood, anything." Richard watched as she disappeared with the nurse. He wanted to say something, anything, but words had deserted him. He felt the weight of his own heartbeat, each pulse reminding him that for all his money and power, he couldn't control this. Hours later, Angela returned, holding a sheet of paper. Her lips trembled before she could speak. "I'm not a match," she whispered. The words broke her in half. She slumped into a chair, clutching the paper to her chest, rocking back and forth as if motion could undo fate. Richard's throat tightened. He had seen desperation before, when people begged for extensions, when employees pleaded for mercy, but this was different. This wasn't business. This was a mother watching her world crumble. He stayed longer than he intended. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sorrow, and he hated both. Yet he couldn't leave. Through the window, he saw Angela inside Lila's room. The little girl lay hooked to machines, her chest rising and falling in fragile rhythm. Angela sat beside her, brushing strands of hair from her forehead and whispering something, maybe a lullaby, maybe a prayer. Richard's reflection stared back at him from the glass, his own eyes red, his jaw tight. The man who once prided himself on being untouchable suddenly felt small. He realized he didn't even know what to do with his hands. He had spent a lifetime building walls of arrogance so tall that even his own emotions couldn't climb over them. But here, in the quiet hum of hospital machines, something inside him shifted. He turned and left, but not toward the car. Instead, he walked into the hospital chapel. It was small, empty, and dimly lit. He stood before the altar, staring at the flickering candles, his reflection caught in the glass of a stained window depicting mercy, something he'd never believed in. He had no prayers to offer. He didn't know how. But as the silence wrapped around him, he whispered, almost unwillingly, "Why her?" The question wasn't directed at anyone, yet it echoed in his chest. For years, he had measured worth in contracts, properties, and influence. Now, watching Angela fight for a life she might lose, he wondered if he had ever truly lived at all. Back in the hospital room, Lila's small voice broke the stillness. "Mama." Angela looked up instantly. "Yes, baby, I'm here." Lila smiled weakly. "Don't cry. I saw Daddy in my dream. He said everything will be okay." Angela bit her lip hard, forcing back another wave of tears. "It will, sweetheart. I promise." Outside the door, Richard froze again. He hadn't meant to overhear, but the words pierced through the hallway like an arrow. He said everything will be okay. Those words haunted him on the drive back to his mansion. The roads blurred. The city lights flashed by like ghosts of choices he never made. When he stepped inside, the silence of his home felt heavier than usual. The echo of laughter, the same that had once come from the garden, lingered in his memory. He walked to the window that overlooked the very spot where Lila had fallen. The tulips were still there, untouched, their petals glistening under the moonlight. Her sketchbook lay on the table where the maid had left it behind in her panic. Richard picked it up. Inside, beneath the unfinished drawing, was a line written in childish handwriting. "For Mama, so she never forgets to smile." His throat tightened. Something unrecognizable burned in his chest, remorse, maybe. Or guilt. Or something even deeper, the realization that for once, he wanted to help but didn't know how. As dawn began to break over Los Angeles, painting the city in gold, Richard Moreau made a silent promise. He didn't yet know what he could do, but he knew he couldn't do nothing. The man who had spent his entire life untouched by pain was about to learn what it meant to feel. The nights had grown longer for Richard Moreau. Sleep, once his faithful escape, had turned against him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same image, Lila's small limp body surrounded by flowers, Angela's trembling hands stained with soil and tears. He had faced hostile takeovers, courtroom battles, and media storms, but none of them had carved into him the way this memory did. In the stillness of his study, the city lights shimmered through the tall windows. He sat behind his mahogany desk, drowning in paperwork that suddenly felt meaningless. The world outside carried on, deals signed, fortunes traded, but his focus was gone. Every tick of the clock echoed like judgment. He leaned back and rubbed his temples, the faint hum of rain tapping against the glass. Deep down, something whispered back. He turned to pour himself a drink, and that was when it happened. A folder slid from the corner of his desk, scattering papers across the floor. He cursed under his breath and bent to gather them. It was an old file, dusty, edges curled. The date stamped on the front read May 11, 2015. The title, Construction Site Incident, Moreau Developments, South Ridge Project. He frowned. That project had been buried years ago. He hadn't thought about it since. Out of habit, he flipped the folder open. Inside was a brief report, a few photos, and a name, one that froze his pulse. Daniel Johnson. For a moment, he didn't breathe. He scanned the document, his eyes darting from one line to another. Fatal accident, crane collapse. Victim, Daniel Johnson. Saved the life of site owner, Richard Moreau, by pushing him clear moments before impact. His hand trembled as he read the final line. Family compensated privately. Case sealed by executive order. Memories he buried clawed their way to the surface. The noise of twisted metal, the deafening crash, the blinding dust. He remembered standing there, covered in blood and dirt, staring at the man crushed beneath the wreckage. Daniel Johnson. The worker who had shouted, "Get down!" right before the crane collapsed. The man who had pushed him aside, only to be caught under a storm of falling steel. Richard had survived that day. Daniel hadn't. He remembered how quickly he'd ordered his legal team to handle it, quietly, discreetly, efficiently. The company paid off the family, sealed the reports, and within weeks, the world moved on. Richard never visited the funeral. He never even saw the widow. Until now. He dropped into his chair, the file still open before him, his chest tightening as realization settled like ice in his veins. Angela Johnson. The name wasn't just familiar, it was history catching up to him. He rose and paced the room, his mind a storm. The woman who scrubbed his floors, who bowed her head and spoke softly, she was the widow of the man who had once saved his life. And the little girl in the hospital bed, she was Daniel's daughter. Richard's throat tightened. He walked to the window, staring into the endless sprawl of Los Angeles. The skyline that once looked like triumph now seemed like a graveyard of forgotten names, the lives he'd stepped over to get here. He whispered the name under his breath, testing it like an old confession. Daniel Johnson. The sound of it hurt. He sank into the chair again, elbows on the desk, head in his hands. For years, he had built his empire on the belief that the past could be controlled, that money could erase memory, that silence could buy forgiveness. But silence, he realized, wasn't the same as peace. It was only a pause before the truth returned to collect its debt. That night, he found himself driving with no destination. The streets blurred past as the city's glow faded into rain. He ended up at a small church, one he hadn't entered since his mother's funeral decades ago. The doors were open. Inside, candles flickered weakly against the darkness. He sat in the back pew, silent. The smell of wax and wood filled the air. A priest walked by and paused, recognizing the stranger who looked both powerful and broken. "Are you here to pray, sir?" the priest asked gently. Richard almost laughed. "I don't know how." The priest smiled faintly. "Then sit. God listens even to silence." Richard stayed long after the priest left, staring at the cross. His mind replayed Daniel's last words, the ones he barely remembered, muffled under the chaos. "Move. Get down." That shout had saved his life. A life he had used to build towers while the man who gave it lay buried in one of them. By dawn, he was back at the hospital. The corridors were quiet, bathed in pale light. Nurses whispered as they passed, recognizing him, the billionaire, the one from the news. He ignored their stares and went straight to the pediatric wing. Through the glass, he saw Angela asleep in a chair beside Lila's bed. Her head rested on her folded arms, exhaustion carved into her face. Lila was motionless except for the steady rise and fall of her chest under the machine's rhythm. Richard stood there, unable to move. Guilt had never felt this physical. It was like gravity, pulling him down. He looked at Angela and thought about all the times he dismissed her presence, all the moments he treated her like part of the furniture. And now, he saw her for who she really was, the widow of a hero. He wanted to step inside, to tell her the truth, but fear held him back. How could he explain that he'd built his fortune on her husband's death? How could he look her in the eye and say the words, "I knew and I did nothing"? He stayed there until a nurse approached softly. "Sir, visiting hours are over." He nodded and turned away. But as he walked down the corridor, something in him shifted. He knew what he had to do. For once in his life, there was no boardroom, no negotiation, no audience. Only a decision, one that would finally settle the debt of silence he had carried for years. He took one last look at the file when he got home. Then he placed it in the fireplace and watched the pages curl and blacken in the flames. But even as the paper turned to ash, the weight didn't lift. Some debts, he realized, can't be burned away. They can only be paid, with action. And before the sun rose again, Richard Moreau made a vow. He would not let Daniel Johnson's daughter die. Not this time. The following morning began like any other for the world outside. Cars honking, phones ringing, lives moving forward. But inside Richard Moreau's mansion, time had stopped. He hadn't slept. The night before, he had stood too long by his window, watching the city lights flicker like a pulse, wondering how many of those lights belonged to people who still believed in goodness. He used to think power was all that mattered. Now, it felt like a prison built of gold and regret. By sunrise, he made a call. "Dr. Wallace," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I need a compatibility test done. Immediately." The doctor hesitated. "For whom, Mr. Moreau?" "For a child," Richard replied. "Her name is Lila Johnson." There was a pause on the other end, long enough to carry the shock that Dr. Wallace couldn't express. The billionaire never did favors, never showed emotion, never involved himself in anything that didn't benefit him directly. "I'll arrange it right away," the doctor said finally. But Richard wasn't done. "No one can know," he said firmly. "Not the press. Not my staff. Not even her mother." Within the hour, his private medical team arrived in silence. They drew his blood and left without questions. The results, they promised, would come before nightfall. The waiting was unbearable. He paced through his office, the same office where he had once celebrated billion-dollar victories. Now, every corner of it felt like a confessional booth. He stared at Daniel Johnson's name on the burned remnants of that file, the ghost of a man who had saved him without hesitation, without profit, without a single demand. And now fate had presented him with one last chance to answer that act of sacrifice, not with words, but with flesh and blood. When the results arrived, the doctor's voice trembled slightly. "You're a perfect match." The words landed like a sentence and a salvation all at once. Richard said nothing at first. He just stood there, staring at the report, his reflection blurred in the window behind it. The man who had built skyscrapers and silenced enemies suddenly looked small. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had all the money in the world, yet the one thing that could make a difference wasn't something he could buy. He could walk away. No one would know. Not Angela. Not Lila. Not the world. And yet, he couldn't shake Daniel's face from his mind, the moment frozen in time when the worker had met his eyes before shoving him clear of the collapsing crane. The memory played over and over, not as a tragedy, but as a question. What are you willing to give, now that you have everything? By evening, he was at the hospital again. He didn't announce his presence. He simply stood outside Lila's room, invisible behind the glass. Inside, the machines beeped in steady rhythm, fragile but determined. Angela sat at her daughter's bedside, holding her small hand, whispering something through tears. Her other hand clutched a worn photo, her late husband, smiling in a construction vest. The sight broke him. Not with noise, but with stillness. He had spent a lifetime avoiding vulnerability, and now, standing there, he understood what real strength looked like. It wasn't in domination or wealth. It was in love that refused to give up, even when the world had already decided it should. He found Dr. Wallace waiting down the hall. "Schedule the operation," Richard said quietly. The doctor's eyes widened. "You understand what that means, Mr. Moreau? It's major surgery. There are risks. Recovery won't be easy." "I understand," he replied. "Just make sure she lives." Dr. Wallace hesitated again. "Should we inform the mother?" Richard shook his head. "No. She'll refuse if she knows it's me. Just tell her, a donor was found. When the papers were brought in, his signature came out shaky for the first time in his life. The same hand that had signed empires into existence now trembled over a single line, the line between selfishness and redemption. Later, as he sat alone in the preparation room, dressed in a thin hospital gown, the hum of the fluorescent light filled the silence. His assistant had called multiple times. He ignored every one. He didn't want witnesses. He didn't want gratitude. He just wanted to pay a debt long overdue. As the anesthesiologist entered, she asked gently, "Are you ready, sir?" He took a deep breath. "No," he said truthfully. "But I'm doing it anyway." They rolled him toward the surgery wing. The sterile walls passed like pages of a story, finally reaching its turning point. And as the bright lights flooded his vision, he thought of Angela's voice, soft, calm, patient, and of the little girl's laughter that once filled his garden. He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek, the first one he had allowed in decades. Meanwhile, down the hall, Angela sat in the waiting room, hands clasped tightly, unaware of what was unfolding. A nurse approached her with cautious optimism. "Good news," she said gently. "We found a donor. The surgery will begin shortly." Angela gasped, covering her mouth. "A donor? Who would do such a thing?" "I'm sorry, ma'am," the nurse said softly. "Confidentiality policy. But your daughter's chances are good." Angela's knees gave way. She sank into the chair, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, God," she whispered, clutching the cross at her neck. Back in the operating room, as the anesthesia pulled Richard toward darkness, his last thought wasn't of wealth or reputation. It was of a man named Daniel Johnson, and the daughter who had inherited her father's courage. The surgery lasted hours. When it was over, dawn was breaking. The first rays of sunlight painted the hospital corridors gold. Richard's body lay weak but alive, the monitors beeping steadily. The doctors whispered words like successful, stable, and recovery. None of them knew who he truly was to the child who now lived because of him. And as the city woke to another day of noise and ambition, one man, once feared, once untouchable, slept peacefully for the first time in his life. He had finally done something not for gain, but for grace. If you were in Richard's place, would you have done the same, given a part of yourself to save the child of someone you barely knew? Would guilt drive you to redemption, or would pride keep you untouched? Share your thoughts below, because sometimes, one choice defines the rest of your life. The sterile air of the hospital carried a stillness that could suffocate hope. Hours crawled by like centuries, each second stretching thin under the weight of uncertainty. Angela sat in the waiting room, her trembling hands clutching her coat as though it could hold her together. Her lips moved silently in prayer, not to demand but to beg, for one more heartbeat, one more chance, one more miracle. 6 hours. That was how long the surgery took. 6 hours of pacing, crying, whispering, and bargaining with a God who seemed far away. Nurses came and went, their faces unreadable, their shoes squeaking faintly on the linoleum floor. Angela's heart ached with every passing moment, but her faith clung stubbornly to the thin thread of hope that someone somewhere had done the unthinkable, had given their life to save her child's. When the doors finally opened, the surgeon appeared, his cap removed, his face drawn from exhaustion, but his eyes carried a softness that Angela hadn't seen in days. "Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly. She shot to her feet. Yes, that's me." He smiled, faint but real. "Your daughter is safe. The surgery was successful." Angela's knees buckled beneath her. A sound escaped her throat, a sob mixed with laughter, disbelief, and relief all at once. She pressed her palms together, tears spilling freely. "Thank you, God. Thank you," she whispered, sinking to her seat as her body shook. The doctor hesitated, as if deciding whether to say more. "There's something else," he said carefully. "The donor, he's stable too. You may visit, but please, keep it brief. He's still weak." Angela's brows furrowed. "The donor? But who?" He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Room 204. She didn't wait. Her footsteps echoed through the corridor, her heart racing faster with every turn. She had no idea who to expect, a stranger, a volunteer, some nameless soul guided by mercy. But when she reached the door and looked inside, the air in her lungs disappeared. There, lying pale against white sheets, was Richard Moreau, the billionaire, the untouchable, the man she had feared and served for months. Tubes ran from his arms, his face drained of color, his breath shallow but steady. The monitors beeped softly beside him, marking each fragile second of a life that had once seemed indestructible. His eyes were closed, but his expression was peaceful, not the cold mask of authority she had always seen, but something gentler, almost human. Angela froze. For a moment, her mind refused to believe what her eyes saw. Then it hit her, the truth crashing into her chest with the weight of gratitude and confusion all at once. She stumbled forward, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "No, this can't be." Tears blurred her vision as she sank to her knees beside his bed. Her hands hovered above his, afraid to touch him, afraid to break the moment. "Why?" The word tore from her like a wound, small but sharp. "Why would you do this?" Richard stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, his breath uneven. For a moment, he struggled to focus, his vision cloudy. Then he saw her, and a weak smile lifted the corner of his lips. "Because," he rasped, his voice hoarse, "I owed your husband my life." Angela's breath caught. Richard continued, each word strained but sincere. "Daniel saved me, years ago. He pulled me out from under that crane. I buried it, buried him, buried the truth. And now," he winced, his voice breaking, "it took me too long to pay it back." Angela's tears came harder. She shook her head in disbelief, gripping the rail of the bed. You remembered him?" Richard nodded faintly. "I remembered everything. His voice. His courage. The way he didn't even hesitate. I've lived with that moment for years, his sacrifice, my silence. I built empires on that guilt. And when I saw your daughter," he paused, the effort draining him, "I saw a second chance. A chance to be something other than what I became." Angela covered her mouth, sobbing softly. She didn't know whether to thank him or to curse the years of silence. This was the man who had walked past her pain, who had never seen her humanity. Yet here he was, broken and bleeding, having given a piece of himself to save the only thing she loved most. "Mr. Moreau," she whispered, "you didn't have to." "I did," he interrupted gently. "Because no one should die paying the price for my mistakes." For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the quiet rhythm of their breathing, the hum of the machines filling the space between them. Angela finally reached out and took his hand. It was cold, trembling, but alive. "Thank you," she said softly, her tears soaking his skin. "For what you've done, for who you chose to be today." He blinked slowly, fighting to stay awake. "You shouldn't thank me," he murmured. "I'm not a good man, Angela. But maybe your daughter will grow up believing people can change." Angela held his hand tighter, her heart swelling with something she hadn't expected to feel toward him, forgiveness. "No one starts good or bad, Mr. Moreau," she said through quiet tears. "We just choose which we feed." Richard's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then I hope I finally fed the right one." She let out a shaky laugh, brushing away her tears. "You did." Moments later, the nurse entered to adjust his but Angela didn't move. She stayed by his side until he drifted into sleep, his breathing slow but steady. In that sterile white room, surrounded by machines and silence, something extraordinary had happened. Not just the saving of a life, but the saving of two souls. The man who once ruled through fear had learned humility. The maid who once lived unseen had found grace. And between them, a bond had formed, not of status or debt, but of shared redemption. When Angela later returned to Lila's room, her daughter was awake. The color had returned to her cheeks, her small hand reaching out. "Mama," she whispered, "was it the angel you prayed for?" Angela smiled through her tears. "Yes, baby," she said softly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "He came when we least expected him." If you were in Angela's place, could you forgive the man who once ignored your pain if he gave his own body to save your child? Would your heart choose resentment or redemption? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because sometimes, forgiveness is the greatest miracle of all. The world never stays silent for long, especially when a story like this escapes. It began with a nurse's whisper. A rumor passed from one hospital corridor to another until it reached the waiting ears of a journalist. Within 24 hours, the city's front pages bled with headlines. Ruthless Billionaire donates kidney to Maid's daughter. The Untouchable shows mercy. A miracle in marble and blood. The cameras came like vultures, circling the hospital gates, their lenses thirsty for the image of a man they once painted as soulless. News vans parked along the street, their antennas slicing the air like metallic spears. Reporters shouted questions Richard never answered. He refused interviews. He declined the awards. He didn't allow the hospital to release photos. When a journalist begged for just one quote, he simply replied, "Some things lose meaning when explained." And that was all he said. When he was discharged weeks later, he didn't return to his empire with its marble floors and mirrored halls. Instead, he went home to silence, and for the first time in his life, he welcomed it. His mansion, once a symbol of dominance, now felt foreign. Every inch of it reminded him of the emptiness that had consumed him for years. The paintings, the chandeliers, the endless corridors, they no longer held power. He moved through the house like a man rediscovering gravity. His steps were slower now, more deliberate. Every movement reminded him of the scar that ran across his side, the mark of his choice, the proof that even kings can bleed. Angela visited him a few days after his return. She came quietly, as always, carrying a small basket of soup and homemade bread. Her presence filled the empty air without trying. She didn't thank him again. She had already said everything that needed saying in the hospital. Instead, she simply sat across from him at the large dining table that once seated guests who feared him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then in her calm, steady voice she said, "Sometimes God humbles us not to punish but to heal." He looked up at her. The words lingered between them, simple but heavy. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. But something inside him shifted, again. From that day forward, their visits became a quiet routine. Sometimes Angela came with soup, sometimes with silence. Occasionally, she brought Lila, who would draw while the two adults spoke in soft tones. Lila had grown stronger. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her laughter, that beautiful sound that had once filled the garden, returned too. Richard would sit on the patio, pretending to read while secretly watching her play among the flowers she had drawn before she collapsed months ago. The same tulips now bloomed in real life, vibrant and alive. The world didn't understand Richard's transformation, and perhaps it wasn't meant to. But change rarely announces itself, it just happens, one quiet act at a time. He began liquidating parts of his empire. Buildings that once stood as monuments to greed and control were sold off, their proceeds redirected into something new, something human. He established the Daniel Johnson Foundation, named after the man who had saved his life long ago. Its mission was simple but profound: to fund free medical care for underprivileged families, provide scholarships for children of laborers, and build clinics in low-income neighborhoods. When his advisors questioned his decision, reminding him how it would dent his financial legacy, he smiled faintly. "I've already built enough monuments to my ego," he said. "Now I'd like to build one to his memory." And he meant it. In time, the Daniel Johnson Foundation became a name spoken with reverence. Hospitals carried its emblem. Schools wrote it on walls beside murals of compassion and courage. The city that once feared Richard Moreau now honored him, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had found his soul. Angela watched all of it unfold with quiet pride. She never sought attention. Whenever the media tried to interview her, she politely declined. "The story isn't mine," she said. "It belongs to Grace." Their friendship, once unimaginable, became something sacred. They never spoke about the past anymore. There was no need. It lived quietly between them, like an old scar that no longer hurt but reminded them where healing began. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in amber light, Richard stood by the garden where it had all begun. The air smelled of rain and tulips. Angela joined him, holding 2 cups of tea. He glanced at her and said softly, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different? If I hadn't been there that day?" Angela smiled faintly. "No," she replied. "Because everything that happens, even the pain, leads us somewhere we need to be." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then I suppose I needed to fall before I could learn to stand." They stood there in silence, 2 souls from different worlds bound by one story, one tragedy, one miracle, one redemption. And as dusk deepened, the mansion lights flickered on, not with the cold, sterile brightness they once had, but with a gentle glow, as if the house itself had softened. The man once feared by all had learned the greatest lesson of power, that it meant nothing without compassion. His empire of steel and glass no longer defined him, it was the lives he touched that told his story now. Lila's laughter carried through the garden again, mingling with the evening breeze. Angela looked toward her daughter and then back at Richard. "You gave her life," she said quietly. "But you also gave mine back too." Richard smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "No," he said. "You both gave me mine." The sound of the city faded into the distance, replaced by the hum of crickets and the heartbeat of peace, the kind he had never known in all his years of wealth. And for the first time, Richard Moreau, the man the world once called the Untouchable, felt something he had chased all his life without knowing it. Not success. Not control. Peace. The seasons shifted gently over Los Angeles, washing away the noise of headlines and gossip. The frenzy that had once surrounded Richard Moreau's act of sacrifice had long faded. The world had moved on, as it always did. New scandals replaced old miracles. New billionaires rose, and others fell. But somewhere in a quiet mansion on the hill, life had found a different rhythm, one defined not by profit or power, but by peace. Lila's recovery was complete. The little girl who once lay pale and still now ran through the hospital halls laughing, her energy filling the sterile corridors with life. The nurses adored her, she'd become their small symbol of hope, proof that goodness still existed, even in the most unexpected corners of the world. Every week, she and Angela visited Richard's home. What had once been a palace of arrogance now felt like a sanctuary. The sharp echoes of footsteps that used to bounce off marble walls were now replaced by the hum of quiet conversation, the occasional laughter of a child, and the distant cooing of doves that had nested near the balcony. Richard had changed, visibly, deeply. His posture was softer, his words fewer but warmer. The darkness in his eyes had lifted, replaced by something lighter, humbler. He no longer wore the armor of superiority that once shielded him from human connection. The suits were still there, but they hung looser, like remnants of a man he no longer needed to be. Lila had made it her mission to fill the house with color. Every week, she brought a new drawing for him, a flower, a sunset, a stick figure family holding hands. But one afternoon, she arrived with something different. She found Richard in his study, sitting behind a desk stripped of its former purpose. The stock charts and ledgers that had once filled the walls were gone, replaced by framed photos of the clinics, schools, and playgrounds built by the Daniel Johnson Foundation. Lila walked up to him, holding out a paper she had kept carefully folded. "I made you something," she said, grinning shyly. Richard smiled. "Another masterpiece." She nodded, unfolding it with the seriousness of a true artist. It was a drawing of a tall man, him, handing a heart-shaped gift to a small girl. Above their heads, she had written in uneven, colorful letters, "Thank you for my new heart." Richard's throat tightened. He took the paper gently, his fingers trembling as he studied it. There were tears in his eyes, but this time, they came without shame. "Do you like it?" she asked softly. "I love it," he said. "More than anything else in this room." He framed it immediately and placed it beside his desk, in the same spot where his stock market monitors once hung. And for the first time in years, that corner of his office held not ambition, but meaning. Angela watched from the doorway, her heart full. She had seen many sides of this man, the cold billionaire, the silent patient, the repentant donor, but this version, the quiet, grateful one, was her favorite. "Lila," she said gently, "we should let Mr. Moreau rest." Lila turned to leave but paused, looking back. "Can I come again next week?" Richard smiled faintly. "I'll be waiting." When they were gone, the house fell silent once more. But it wasn't the emptiness of before. It was peace, the kind of silence that feels alive, like a deep breath after a long cry. Later that week, Richard attended a press conference he had long postponed. The media had begged for one final statement, one explanation for the act that had stunned the world. For months, he had refused, saying that no words could translate what he had felt. But now, sitting beneath the soft glare of cameras, he realized that the truth didn't need embellishment. A journalist raised her hand. "Mr. Moreau, why did you do it?" He looked at her, his voice calm, almost tender. "Because no fortune is worth a soul," he said. "I spent half my life rich but empty. That child gave me what money never could, a reason to feel." There was no follow-up question. None was needed. His words fell into the silence like prayer. That evening, as the sun sank behind the city, painting the horizon in gold and violet, Richard returned home alone. He walked through the garden, the same garden where a little girl had once collapsed among tulips, now blooming brighter than ever. He paused beside them, running his hand across their petals. He thought of Daniel Johnson, the man who had once given him life. Of Angela, the woman who had taught him forgiveness. And of Lila, the child who had taught him to feel. Inside, the mansion glowed with warm light. On the study wall, Lila's drawing caught the last ray of sunset. The paper shimmered faintly, as if alive, the heart in the picture glowing red in the evening light. Richard smiled at it, whispering quietly, "Thank you, kiddo." He turned off the light and sat near the window, watching the stars emerge over the city he had once tried to own. For the first time, he didn't feel the urge to conquer anything. He just wanted to be still. In another part of the city, Angela tucked Lila into bed. The child yawned, sleepy but smiling. "Mama," she said softly, "Mr. Moreau's not lonely anymore, right?" Angela brushed her daughter's hair from her forehead. "No, baby," she whispered. He finally found what he was missing. Lila smiled, her eyes closing. His heart. Angela nodded. Yes. His heart. The apartment light dimmed, and the hum of the city filled the space between their quiet breaths. Meanwhile, high in the hills, the mansion that had once been a fortress of pride now stood as a symbol of something else entirely: redemption, humility, love. And in that high room, the framed drawing caught the moonlight. The colors shimmered softly against the glass, the little girl's smile frozen in time, the heart between her and the man glowing like a promise fulfilled. Even stone, the night seemed to whisper, can remember it was once clay. And somewhere in the vast stillness of the world, Richard Moreau, the man who had once been untouchable, finally felt. Sometimes, the greatest battles aren't fought in boardrooms or courts, but inside the human heart. He had everything, until life forced him to choose between pride and purpose. And in the end, Richard Moreau didn't just save a child, he saved himself. If this story touched you, if it made you believe that even the coldest hearts can still find light, tell us in the comments, would you forgive the man who once ignored your pain, if he gave everything to make it right? Drop your answer below. Your words might touch someone who needs this message tonight. And if you believe more people should see stories that heal, stories that remind us what being human truly means, like this video, share it with someone you care about, and don't forget to subscribe. Because here, every story is a heartbeat, and every heartbeat tells a truth worth remembering.